actually suffer. In terms of safety, in terms of compassion, in terms of healthiness, and and somebody mentioned earlier about kind of a healthy community. I think when we talk about it though, no one is more impacted than the person that's using drugs themselves, because they are in pain. And by the time somebody comes to look for help or in treatment, they are in a lot of pain. They have a lot of shame. They have a lot of guilt. We also sometimes say they have a lot of denial, but that's kind of part of kind of coming to terms with how they've managed to live and maybe the things that they've done over the last number of years. But families themselves, I suppose when we talk about addiction, for some, it might be a slow process. The process of someone developing addiction can take a long time. It may happen over months or years. It kind of seeps in to some family homes. But for others, it can happen quite quickly. And that might sometimes depend on the type of drug they're taking, their personality, their environment, etc. When we talk about families, and I'll talk about it in kind of two separate pieces, I'll talk about adults and I'll talk about children, because some of the impacts can be a little bit different. And I suppose in ways, and this is one of the questions that I'll pose to yourselves, do families talk about it? Do families talk about addiction themselves? We're a great nation in this country to talk about everyone else bar ourselves. We even talk in the third party, and I'm pretty guilty of it myself. But it's one of those very, very kind of private things that we try to keep within the family unit itself. And that in itself can be soul destroying, because addiction grows on silence. Addiction grows on emptiness and shame. And I suppose if we think about then, well, how do families try to deal with it? Because if they're not talking about it, it can be very difficult to deal with it. And you'll often find families try to deal with it themselves for years. When I worked in treatment, we used to often say to family members, in some ways you're even sicker than the addict. Now it's a little bit dated, that type of term, but what it really means is that one person that can actually get sick, the other people are sick around, because you're worried, because you've got a sense of shame, because you're trying to fix somebody. When you love somebody and they're gone off and they're drinking or they're drugging, there's nothing more powerless than standing there knowing I cannot do anything for my wife, my husband, my child. So families typically try to deal with it themselves. And people will look back even when they're sharing their own stories and family members and they go, God, I can't believe how crazy I was. I even had a family member ring me recently about her son. She's after sending him over to the other side of the world to do kickboxing. Now, it might work, I don't know, but it felt like it was a one way of kind of trying to deal with it. But for someone else, it might be, well, do we put him out of the house? Do we keep him in? And all those kind of battles that go on. I am also a little bit conscious when I'm talking about families, because every family is unique, and even the experience of addiction within a family can be unique. So I feel like I'm very much generalising a very, very serious problem, so kind of apologies for that. This is a slide I took from ADFAM, which is an organisation in the UK that do a lot of advocacy work. But when you talk about impacts on family members, these are just really kind of a snapshot. We're seeing of late, particularly in the last couple of years, I get a lot more calls around drug debts, families getting into difficulties. One mother that I worked with, they remortgaged their house for 30,000 to pay off debts. And that's another 20 years onto their mortgage type thing. For others, it can be difficult even maintaining work during stress. If you've got this going on at home, if you're worried about somebody coming home or whatever, or whether children will be collected from school, or will the dinner be cooked, it's very hard to kind of focus on your work and try not to worry about these type things. Another thing I suppose that we're coming across more so in the last few years is grandparents are now being financially impacted more than ever as well. So not only have they got the concern about maybe their son or daughter, they're now worried about their grandchildren. And sometimes, and particularly this time of year, kids are going back to school and things like that, and grandparents will say they not only don't have the energy, but they don't have the financial means. We talk about physical health. And again, if you're dealing with something for a long time, that you're worried, and I hear it's almost conflictual. Some people will tell you, oh, I can't sleep, I worry about him, what if he doesn't come home tonight, you know? And for other people then it's the opposite. What if he does come home tonight? You know, that they're walking on eggshells, that they're worried about their kids, and things like that. They may experience domestic violence in the home, there may be physical abuse. And these things tend to kind of get worse over time. And when you're a family member and the first time something like this happens, you try to deal with it. And then the next day and the next day, you get worn down, you get worn out. That kind of leads to stress. And I think we're talking about, and different speakers have mentioned stress and the harms that it can do. Long-term stress can be so damaging to the body and to the mind. And when we talk about stress, we're talking about, you know, physical pain, back pain, headaches, stomach pains, things like that. I often ask people when they go to the doctor, when they come to me, and I say, have you spoken to the doctor? Yes, I've got pain relief, or I've got anti-anxiety tablets, or he's given me sleeping tablets. And I'd say, have you spoken about your son or daughter having a problem? No, I haven't. And there's no association then with maybe distress and what's going on in the home. And they often don't associate it either, you know. So, and when we talk about, I suppose, stress, then the pressures that it puts on family relationships, each individual in the family, while they work as a unit, may have different opinions and thoughts on how a family should operate and what they should do with their loved one that's abusing substances. For some, it's the threats, the dealing, the manipulating, the coercing, the pleading, and often families that I've worked with, they've tried everything. You know, they've tried, I've promised him, I gave him money, I paid for this, I paid for him to go away and do a course, all this type of thing. And if you've got kind of, you know, siblings maybe living in the family as well, and there isn't a whole pile of research on siblings, but they can be very, very hurt. They can be kind of jealous, because often if there's a, you know, their sister's taking drugs, the attention is all on her. And I'm the one that's doing well in school, and I'm not getting any kind of credit here whatsoever. And we often kind of speak in terms of they're the forgotten child. In terms of isolation, this is one of the things that people often find. I'll give you an example. If it's your partner, for example, that drinks too much or whatever, you're invited to a wedding. Maybe you don't want to go to that wedding because you're terrified that there'll be a row or there'll be an argument. So you start avoiding family occasions, you start withdrawing. You mightn't invite people over to your house. You mightn't invite the girls over on a Friday evening for a glass of wine. Only one, mind, but because you might be under a little bit of pressure to kind of make sure that he won't be there or that type of thing. I'm conscious that I'm talking a lot about him, but we've also kind of seen recently in the last few years an increase in female substance misuse. So it's right, it's across both genders.